Hello, I'm Steven Roy Goodman. Welcome back to another edition of Higher Education Today. I'm in Largo, Maryland, where we'll be talking about whether the United States is an empire. Dr. Michel Gobat is an associate professor of history at the University of Pittsburgh. Michel is the author of Empire by Invitation, a book published by Harvard University Press. Kiki Skagen Munshi is a former U.S. senior foreign service officer. Kiki has served in India, Romania, Greece, Nigeria, Tanzania, Sierra Leone, and Iraq. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
Well, thanks for coming on. Maybe, Michel, if we could start with you. A simple question, I guess, but perhaps a profound one. What is an empire, and is the U.S. an empire?
Well, it sounds like a simple question, but it's not a simple question to answer, and one could spend a whole semester answering that question. Basically, the most basic answer to what is an empire is essentially that you have a strong state that exerts quite a strong degree of political control over a weaker state. In the case of the U.S., it's a complicated way. It's very difficult to answer. If you go back to the 19th century, when the U.S. expanded westward, I think people would say it's pretty easy to make the case that the U.S. is an empire because it subjugated Native American societies. And so whenever a superpower subjugates another state, particularly when it's people who speak a different language or of a different race or have a different culture, there I think it's easy to make the case that that power is an empire. So that would be the case for the U.S. in the 19th century. You could also make a strong case that the U.S. was an empire in the early 20th century when it occupied a number of countries in both the Caribbean and the Pacific. This was after the War of 1898 when the U.S. defeated Spain. And as many people know, one island in the Caribbean, Puerto Rico, became a U.S. colony, and the same happened to the Philippines in the Pacific. The problem is what happens after World War II, when the U.S. becomes a superpower and exerts influence at the global level in an unprecedented way. There are many people who would say the U.S. still continues to act as an empire. However, complicating things is that this is precisely the moment when a lot of the European empires start to fall apart. This is what scholars call the process of decolonization. So, for example, British India becomes independent. A number of French and British colonies in Africa become independent. This is precisely the moment when the concept or the term empire becomes, to put it bluntly, a dirty word. Yet this is also when the U.S. starts becoming really a superpower at the global level. So it's not surprising that a lot of people are reluctant to use the term empire to describe the role the U.S. played both during the Cold War and after until the present day. However, there are a number of people who make a strong case that yes, the U.S. acted as an empire during the Cold War and continues to act as an empire. And they largely make their argument for two reasons. One is political. You have a lot of people who are very critical of U.S. intervention throughout the world. And not surprisingly, because they're so critical of U.S. intervention, they would say the U.S. is acting as if it were an empire. It's an imperialist power. What's interesting is that there's some people who make the same argument but believe that actually it's good that the U.S. is an empire. You saw that, for example, in the lead up to the Iraq War, the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, where a number of very prominent public intellectuals, and not just those who were aligned with the policies of President George W. Bush, but including liberals who are very opposed to his policies in general, they were claiming that actually U.S. invasion of Iraq was a good thing. It was a way to spread democracy, U.S. ideals of material progress, that Iraq could only benefit from the U.S. occupation. So they were basically making the argument the U.S. is actually a benign empire, an empire of liberty destined to spread democracy. So they're making a political argument, but basically saying that the U.S. should be acting as an empire, and that was a good thing for the world. Very quickly, the other group is making more an analytical argument. So it's not making a political argument, but basically saying that we gain a lot. There's much to be gained of understanding how the U.S. acts as a global power if we define the U.S. as an empire. On the one hand, if you use the concept of empire, you can sort of link U.S. interventions that seem disparate, not connected to each other. That's one way you can link them. For example, the humanitarian intervention in Yugoslavia in the 1990s, or the Iraq invasion, or the fact that there are a number of U.S. military bases in Japan and in Germany. If you use the concept of empire, that's one way in which you can link all this. Second, and I would say the more convincing case, is that if we use the concept of empire to sort of describe how the U.S. acts as a global power, both during the Cold War and after the Cold War, that also allows us to sort of compare the U.S. as a global power with earlier superpowers other superpowers earlier in history, such as the British Empire in the 19th century, or you can go all the way back to the old Romans. I think as historians, we gain a lot by making these kind of comparisons. We better understand how the U.S. exerts its influence at the global level, if we understand how the British did in the 19th century, or even the Romans. And so for some scholars, and these are not necessarily historians, but maybe more political scientists, they think that we can maybe sort of figure out the trajectory of U.S. empire by seeing what happened to the former empires, because they believe that most empires follow a similar trajectory, a similar development. And so they're wondering if now, after we've seen the rise of the U.S. as a modern empire after World War II, are we now witnessing the fall of the empire? And if so, is there something that can be learned about the experience that the British had when their empire fell apart, or the Romans?
Well, fair enough. And Kiki, you practiced diplomacy for many years for the State Department. Do you have a thing or two to say about what Michel just said, and perhaps whether or not universities have had any role in empire building, if we are going to use that term?
Well, Michel's answer was tremendously comprehensive. It leaves me almost without a great deal to say. I did look into what empire and colonialism meant to other people. Stanford University did a very interesting short paragraph on the two concepts. And I think when you get into the definition of empire, you become almost tied up. For instance, we have trade with a lot of countries. Often the trade is to our advantage because that's what we want, but it's not necessarily an imperial relationship with them. So I think I might go a little further and try to say that if you're talking about empire as having some influence on the actual governing of other countries, so that that is to your perceived advantage, then you have perhaps more of an imperial relationship than simply a back and forth trade or exchange of ideas relationship. And I think that we have this in a number of ways, partly through education and universities, because our empire is, as he alluded to, often in the area of ideas and in spreading democracy, the idea that we think democracy is the best form of government for most peoples. And since we have a very large number of foreign students, and we work to attract those foreign students, and they come here and they're exposed to American ways of ideas and doing things, when they go back, if they go back, and many don't, they take a lot of that with them. I'm not sure that we would call that empire, though.
What would you call it then?
Influence?
Fair enough. And if it's influence, maybe I could throw this to both of you, is there a difference between how a university influences the world versus Coca-Cola versus the US government or the British government?
Well, as Kiki pointed out, I mean, she was alluding to the fact that there may be different forms of empire imperialism. Historians use the term informal imperialism or informal empire to identify or to label powers that exert influence largely through trade relations or economic relations. They recognize that that is not the same as, for example, exerting power as if you were a colonial power, where you concretely control not just the territory, but also the local government. So there are various degrees of influence. But going back to the question whether there's a difference between a university or a corporation like Coca-Cola exerting or acting as an imperial or an agent of imperialism, Again, that's a complicated question, and I guess that's the favorite answer of the historian, right? We like to go and focus more on specific case studies, but there have been a number of historians that would clearly state that at the level of corporations that they've played a very important role in spreading or in buttressing U.S. imperialism. For example, that in the 1920s, there's a term called dollar diplomacy, where U.S. banks played a very important role in allowing the U.S. government to exert great control over other countries, particularly in Latin America. In a nutshell, basically, that the U.S. government forced other governments to hand over control over the government finances to Wall Street bankers. This was usually seen as a form where actually the U.S. government was supporting Wall Street bankers, U.S. corporations. In other words, that diplomacy was supporting dollars. New research has actually shown it's more the other way around. That is, the corporations were helping the U.S. government carry out their policies. In the case of universities, it's more complicated. When scholars, historians of U.S. imperialism look at universities, they tend to look more at universities established by missionaries. There they see that, for example, the American University in Beirut started out as a college run by Protestant missionaries. They would see that as a form of helping pave the path for U.S. influence that might eventually become a form of U.S. imperialism.
Maybe I should jump in here. I think that part of what he alluded to was the intentionality of doing things. And most universities nowadays don't intentionally export any kind of influence. It happens unintentionally as students go back. I think, however, the U.S. government sometimes does have influence on other governments that is quite intentional and is not just directed toward the relationship between the two countries, but toward the internal workings of the government. And here I'm thinking of our aid to developing countries, our democratization aid, our aid to help them develop free markets and court systems. This is in the best of intentions, but often we are getting people to change their governments in ways that they otherwise might not have done because we are exerting influence over them economically and in other ways.
And what would be an example of how the intentions could be perceived in such a scenario?
I was in one African country where we had a man come to help work with him on anti-corruption, which I think all of us would agree would be to the country's benefit to reduce the level of corruption. However, the people in the government at the time weren't particularly interested in reducing the level of corruption in the government. That's one possible example.
Well, fair enough. Michel, you want to
jump in and say that right now we're talking a lot about intentions and the U.S. ability to maybe reshape other societies. But what we've now, people who focus on these kind of issues from a historical perspective, what they've now realized is that maybe in the past we've exaggerated the power of the U.S. to reshape other societies. So when you come to education, for example, there are some unintended consequences that may, just because someone's educated in a U.S.-run university, does not necessarily mean that they will then become a very, to put it bluntly, a tool of the U.S. empire. In fact, the opposite can occur, that people who have that kind of education then feel like they know very well how the U.S. works or how the U.S. is exerting its power at the international level. And they try to use that knowledge to sort of undermine U.S. efforts to control the destinies of their own country. One classic example would be Cuba. Cuba experienced a revolution in 1959. At the very beginning, the U.S. government and much of the U.S. public opinion supported that revolution. They felt it was a democratic revolution, a nationalist revolution. By 1962, it had turned into a communist revolution. Who were the people who were driving that turn towards communism? Well, there's a group of Cubans who were highly educated, highly Americanized. They were either educated in U.S. universities in the United States, or they were educated in U.S.-run missionary schools in Cuba. These highly Americanized Cubans played a very important role in radicalizing a revolution that became, in many ways, the very opposite of what the U.S. thought Cuba needed. So the point I'm trying to make is that there are unintended consequences, and in understanding these kind of questions, we have to look at not just the issue from the side of the U.S., but also looking at its impact at the local level and take into account the key role that local actors can play in shaping these kind of encounters.
But you might not know what's going to happen in the future. So if you're a university administrator trying to recruit students in country X or Y, you don't really know what's going to happen to those students later on.
True.
No, and I hear the diplomatic corps actually does a great deal to try to help university administrators recruit students, and the motive has nothing to do with imperialism or imperial ambitions in the country. You know that we have Fulbright commissions, we have student advising in most countries in the world to bring them to the United States, and a lot of that is I think with twin motives. One is the idea that our education system is good and that people will learn about democracy and the way things are done in the United States, which is true. And the other is that it's a good source of revenue for universities in the United States.
Well, and to that point, there's an old admissions joke, or it's not so old, but it's a reasonably old admissions joke about international students being a drug, where a lot of universities can't get off the drug because if it weren't for X number of international students per class, it would be very difficult to balance the books of a lot of universities.
Well, I can't speak to that, but I can tell you that for years now, most of our engineering students have been foreign students. And as far back as 1970, when I was working at the University of California, Berkeley, there was talk about the fact that we didn't have many Americans going into engineering, and thank goodness many of our engineering students who were from other countries stayed in the United States and contributed to the economy and to the growth of the country after their education.
I think there's also another contribution by having foreign students be in the United States and take courses at U.S. universities, and maybe even hiring foreigners to teach in the U.S. universities. I, for example, am a Swiss citizen. I came to the U.S. to study at the graduate level and stayed here. And I teach a course on U.S.-Latin American relations. And one thing that struck me is that I think students in general appreciate the way I raise questions about their own political system that I think in general they wouldn't have thought of because I come from a very different political culture. In Switzerland, we have, for example, we don't have a two-party system. Our government is made up of, if I'm not mistaken, 4 or 5 political parties, from a party of the left that would be certainly more liberal, more to the left than the Democratic Party in the U.S., to a conservative party that in many ways one could argue is more to the right than the Republican Party. So we have a huge ideological governing parties that represent a huge ideological range. When I explain these kind of issues to students, I think it forces them to rethink what they mean by democracy. They have a tendency to think that what is good for the U.S. is good for the rest of the world. And then when you have foreigners talking more about their own experiences, I think that allows students to sort of be confronted with questions that maybe wouldn't have occurred to them before.
Well, if some of your students were here in the room with us right now, in the studio, do you think they would think that the U.S. is an empire and the University of Pittsburgh is contributing to that empire?
Well, since I'm a history professor, we tend not to talk about contemporary issues. I think they would have very good answers about how maybe the U.S. acted in the past. And they would probably have also a good understanding of maybe how the universities, U.S. universities, played a very important role in upholding what some people would argue was a U.S. empire during the Cold War. One example would be, for example, that largely because of the triumph of the Cuban Revolution in 1959, what you have is the sudden explosion of area studies in the U.S. You have the Centers for Latin American Studies emerging in many number of places. But you also have the same thing with Asian studies. This is also the era of the Vietnam War. Basically, the idea is that the U.S. government wants to train academics, students, who then would help them carry out their foreign policy in areas of the world where the Cold War was actually pretty hot. However, again, there are unintended consequences. The case I know the best is the area studies of Latin America, where you have a lot of centers of Latin American studies emerging, a lot of people being trained with U.S. government support to become Latin Americanists, and here I'm talking about U.S. citizens. But many of them, once they go to Latin America and do their research for their dissertation, for example, they become experts in the field. They come back being very critical of U.S. intervention. And in many ways, you could argue that some of the leading figures of the opposition to U.S. intervention in the late 60s, but particularly in the 1970s, are people who benefited or who were trained from these area studies programs that were supposed to develop people who were going to support U.S. foreign policy.
And I need to jump in here because I went through one of those programs. I did my master's in Indian Studies and NDFL fellowship at Berkeley, and then eventually served in India as our press attaché. And most of the people I knew in the Asian Studies program actually either went into American universities and taught, or did work for the U.S. government, some Defense Department, one was with World Food Aid. So from my point of view, those programs are valuable and actually serve their purpose.
Well, as you probably both know, there's been a lot of criticism about area studies because they can be very political for people who are expert or pseudo-expert in just that region of the world.
That's right, and I think there's some area studies where the level of scholarship is not as good as it would be in mainstream academia. Interestingly enough, in South Asian studies, this is absolutely not true. It's a very high level of scholarships. However, if you are going to be influential in a country, you need to know a great deal about it. You can't simply walk into it without having some background, and universities supply that background in many cases.
And I don't think that was always the case. I mean, my first book was on the U.S. occupation of Nicaragua in the early 20th century, and I was able to read a lot of diplomatic correspondence produced by U.S. diplomats, and I was always struck by how little knowledge they had of places, of regions such as Nicaragua. And I think that has changed, as Kiki pointed out, with the sudden rise of these area studies programs in the 1960s onward.
Well, if I can ask you, Kiki, about when you land in a country, your objective is to represent, or it was, to represent the U.S. government. But that's a very broad mission. What does it really mean to represent the U.S. government? Is it to promote our interests? Is it to promote the quote-unquote U.S. empire? Is it to promote Coca-Cola? Is it to promote Yale University?
All right. An embassy has many different parts. And the traditional function of the embassy is to negotiate with the government on matters of interest to us, from trade treaties to treaties of alliance against common enemies to all kinds of things. But it's a government-to-government kind of relationship. I was originally with the United States Information Agency, now part of the Department of State, and we spoke to the people of the country in various ways, and you came yourself and gave talks and seminars in some of the countries where I served. So we represented a different kind of an interest, but we also have commercial attachés who try to build up trade with the countries. And in some cases, people who are dedicated to educational relations. So now I've wandered because I've lost my focus. So if you will repeat your question, I would appreciate it.
Well, thank you. The issue is really about how the projection of U.S. power through the embassy, and whether or not you agree with that thesis that there really is that projection of power through the embassy.
Well, we prefer to think that it's not too naked. But inevitably, because our interest is the interest of the United States, if there is power to further our interest and benefit our country, we're going to use it. But we tend not to project it we hope not to project it too blatantly. because that is not a good way to win friends and influence people, unless, of course, you have a particular military objective.
And Michel, as someone who's from Switzerland originally, do you have a thing or two to say about this?
Well, let me speak more as a Latin Americanist. Because
a Swiss Latin American.
Because Latin America is the world region that has experienced the most number of U.S. interventions since the early 19th century. And I thought it was interesting the way Kiki pointed out that the embassy is not this homogeneous entity, that there are a lot of different offices, maybe sometimes with competing agendas. That's not often the way in which Latin Americans see the U.S. embassy. They usually see
That's good.
They often see the U.S. embassy. Things have changed now, but I would say certainly until the end of the Cold War, and now with the Venezuela crisis heating up again, who knows how Latin America is going to view the issue. But they often see the U.S. ambassador as representing the embassy, and often the ambassador as a sort of Roman proconsul. In other words, as an agent of the empire. My sense is that often gives too much power to the ambassador, but I don't think we can discount the way in which a lot of Latin Americans believe that in the end that the person calling the shots in the country is is often not their own president, but rather the ambassador, the U.S. ambassador. Now I'm speaking more about the period up to the end of the Cold War. I think once the Cold War ended, things have gotten more complicated. But those memories are still very fresh, and you can see that the ways in which Latin Americans sort of rally around common interests. Whenever the U.S. feels, as Kiki pointed out, acting too nakedly or blunt, in a too blunt way, then there's again these old fears that the U.S. is acting as an empire and that the U.S. ambassador is acting as a proconsul. Those memories are still very fresh.
But wouldn't every country try to act in their own interests?
I think they do. There is a point with the fact that many times countries think that the ambassadors and the United States are more powerful than we actually are and more influential than we actually are and ascribe to us much more than we can do, in fact. And here I think sometimes those students who have come to the United States and attended American universities can be an ameliorating influence, if you will, because they have a better idea of how complex this country is and how many strands of interests go into any particular policy. So we sometimes look on returning students as assistants and ambassadors for us in their own way, although they can, of course, as you've pointed out, have other kinds of agendas and influence as well.
Well, fair enough. We've got about 30 or 40 seconds left. Is there anything that either of you would like to say before we say goodbye today?
It's a complicated question. It's really, really a complicated question.
And if I may just add, I think the one way to look at that question is not just through the eyes of the U.S. I think it's very important also to take into account the non-U.S. experience.
I agree with that.
Well, fair enough. We're going to leave it at that. Thank you both for coming on the show. If you would like additional information about Michel Gobat or Kiki Munshi, please visit history.pitt.edu or careers.state.gov. If you have comments or suggestions about the show, please send an email to highereducationtoday@topcolleges.com. And thank you for watching. We will continue to bring you quality discussions about important matters in today's college and university world. I'm Steven Roy Goodman, and you've been watching Higher Education Today.